welcome to the briefing room. I'm Bill Froehlich from WTCM Radio, and it's our weekly roundup of some of the stories that are making news headlines here in northern Michigan with the journalists that are covering those stories. And joining me at the table this week, John Flesher from the Associated Press. John, thanks so much for coming back in with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good to have you. One of the big hard news stories of the week down in Benzie County, this Kelly Stapleton trial, which is the trial that is not happening now. But the case of the mom and her autistic daughter, you've been covering that from here in Traverse City.
Correct, yes. I did file a story this week when Ms. Stapleton entered her guilty plea to a lesser charge, first-degree child abuse. And she entered that plea on the day before she was scheduled to go to trial, which had generally been predicted to last a couple of weeks, perhaps, or 10 days to a couple of weeks. And instead, it ended pretty abruptly. And she acknowledged during the hearing that took place that she did indeed intend to kill her daughter and herself in what would have been a murder-suicide. And it was obviously a terribly sad situation that touched people throughout northwest lower Michigan, especially over in the Frankfort and Alberta communities where they lived. And so now the only question will be what her sentencing is, and that will be at a later hearing. Date hasn't been set yet. The maximum is life in prison, just as it would have been for the attempted murder charge that was dropped in this plea bargain. But Judge Batzer will obviously have a lot of leeway. He will be looking at the probation report and listening to recommendations from attorneys on both sides and rendering his judgment.
This was a plea deal to child abuse, first-degree child abuse, is that right?
Yes.
Have you had any sense yet from the prosecution or the defense what they'd like to see for sentencing? I know there's a lot of public sentiment for continuing to get Kelly Stapleton some help outside of a jail cell.
Right. In the consultations I had with both sides, neither one was giving any specifics about what they would ask for. That, of course, will come out later. I think that certainly from the defense point of view, there's the contention that Ms. Stapleton had been suffering from some very serious mental problems and really needs treatment. And I spoke also with a psychiatrist who examined her for the defense back in the summer and said that, in her opinion, she was, in fact, mentally ill and was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, among other things, and should get the minimum sentence and treatment. I would suspect that the prosecution will take a harder line on that. We'll see. But there is, I think, a real sense within the community, among people who know her, that there's a lot of compassion there. Certainly, no one condones what she did, but there's a difference of opinion as to what sentence should be, how much prison time she should do, and that will be up to the experts to hash out.
Yeah, there is a real mix of public opinion, it does seem, about the struggles that this mom had gone through, both mentally and with raising an autistic daughter. And you've got the other camp who says it doesn't matter what your justification is. What you did was a crime and you should be punished.
Yeah, that's certainly true. This case has drawn a lot of attention far beyond our region here nationally, because there have been other cases around the country of autistic children or autistic family members who have been abused or even killed by their parents or their caregivers. And there are interest groups who advocate on behalf of autistic people who are terribly concerned about this, understandably so, and who believe that when you have a situation like this and punishment is being considered by a judge, the only real question that should be asked is, how would you sentence the parent of a non-autistic child who did the same thing that Kelly Stapleton did? And that there's really no justification in using the autism of the child, of the victim, as an excuse, because if you do that, then you both devalue the autistic person's life and you encourage copycat crimes from others who may see this as an opportunity to remove someone from their life without having much of repercussions for it. So it will be, again, a very difficult matter for the judge to hash out.
Was the psychiatrist that you talked with, was that the doctor out in California?
It was.
Carol Lieberman?
Yes, right. She has been involved in a number of high-profile cases, and told me that she did examine Ms. Stapleton, I believe, in July of this summer. Right.
And we'll have her on our radio program, but obviously we got some assistance from your reporting and kind of figuring out some of the players in this case. But she was of the mindset that had this gone to trial, that Kelly Stapleton may have been found not guilty.
Well, the strategy of the defense would have been to offer a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, and Ms. Lieberman was prepared to testify that, in her opinion, she was she met the legal definition of insane when she committed the act. So it would have been up to a jury, I guess, to decide whether to accept that or not.
Yeah. I want to kind of go back a step with your role as Associated Press reporter. I mean, we've talked on this program before. You do a lot of environmental reporting. I do. Primarily. How did this assignment come to you? Your work is what we read in the Record Eagle, if I'm correct, and who all wanted that? Obviously, Associated Press tasked you with that, or the Record Eagle requested your assistance?
Well, the Record Eagle, in this particular case, covered the story themselves, did a very fine job. They've followed this from the very beginning and have had some really thorough and well-researched reports on the Stapleton matter. The Associated Press takes an interest in a wide variety of stories that maybe are of greater interest to a local community, but have broader interest. And it really is a judgment call day by day that we have as to what stories will be of interest outside of a particular area. We sort of take that view from 35,000 feet, if you will, and ask ourselves what might people think about this in Detroit or Lansing or in Los Angeles or Miami or wherever. Right. Is this what we consider national news? And in this case, we did consider the Stapleton case national news for pretty obvious reasons. This raises issues that go well beyond our community, well beyond our state, and are being debated around the country. And it was a very touching and poignant matter, and so we certainly wanted to report on what happened and get that news out.
As the trial was fast approaching, and as you said, this could have gone on for a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, was that your assignment? Were you expecting to spend 2 or 3 weeks in Benzie County? And does that, obviously that changes? It
could. We hadn't really nailed down exactly what I was going to do there. I might well have been there for the beginning and the end, certainly, and we might have partnered up with the Record Eagle using some of their reports throughout the trial. We can do that because of our special cooperative arrangement that we have with both the Record Eagle and many of our other newspaper and broadcast clients and members. Sure. And that's one terrific thing about the way the Associated Press works. We're able to augment staff coverage with coverage of our members and subscribers, and to put together a complete report that way. But we would certainly have made sure that we had good, solid reports on that, because it was a case of wide interest.
That brings up another good point, which I know we've talked about before, but just for the sake of the viewers watching here, broadcast stations, TV, radio, often subscribe to the Associated Press wire service, or we're members in a partnership that way. So we will get on our computer the AP story, the AP wire copy, often written by John Flesher. And because of that partnership, you will see a lot of the times the same story in the newspaper as you heard on TV the night before, or vice versa. You'll see it on TV later that night after reading it in the paper. Exactly.
Yeah, it's the Associated Press is actually a very old institution, the oldest news gathering organization in the world, we say. And goes back to the mid-1800s, and the idea from the very beginning was that different news outlets would do better if they, despite being very competitive, if they could, in some cases, pool their resources, put money in together to sort of create a third-party news organization that could provide reports that everyone could use. And that model started out in New York City, just among 6 or 7 newspapers, and it grew over the whole country and created the AP that we have today. And just given the wide world that we have and the complexity of the news, it's really essential that we maintain that model so that when there isn't an AP staff reporter who's right there on the scene, the broadcasters or TV stations, newspapers, radio stations, whoever who do have reporters in the area are willing to share some material with AP, or at least to tip us off that things are happening so we can make phone calls and begin to get the initial reports, and everyone work together to make sure that the people are informed. That's always the primary goal, to make sure that the readers, the viewers
Sure.
Are getting the message.
And you pointed out too that it does work both ways, that you will obviously regularly supply your customers or your partners, radio, TV, newspapers, with content, but there are cases where the TV will send you guys a story and it will pop up on the AP wire later on.
Absolutely, yes. We get a lot of contributions from our members, and we will. Sometimes they're comprehensive enough that we can just make some editing changes to conform to our style and move it right on out. Other times we can use it as sort of a tip for ourselves to do some of our own reporting. Sometimes we need to supplement it with a call or two. It really just depends on the case, but absolutely those contributions are very essential for us.
Well, let me make 2 points to you. One being that it was always, when I was working in television, a dozen plus years in TV, always an honor when I would send a story to AP and it would show up on the wire. I mean, it was very, very highly regarded. So professionally, very appreciative of that. And secondly, it does work both ways. But to be quite honest, we got a lot more out of AP, I think, than we gave to AP. So again, professionally, thank you for that.
Well, that's understandable, and some outlets are bigger contributors than others, but so much depends on the resources that any individual outlet will have, and it's also just a matter of habit, and we will often reach out to a station or a paper that has a certain story and ask if we can use it, and virtually always people are very happy to help us out, so it works well.
Good. Well, I know that we talked about environmental reporting being a lot of your primary focus, and you did a rather interesting piece recently here on bait shops, and you were explaining it to me as we sat down here before we started taping, and kind of a pretty remarkable story about the search for the invasive species DNA.
Yeah, the invasive species are one of the biggest problems confronting the Great Lakes right now. It's been that way for some time. That really goes way back to, I guess you could talk about the sea lamprey, which came about in the early and mid part of the 20th century. But more recently, the big concern has been with the ballast water in freighters and ships that come in from the oceans and dump their ballast into the Great Lakes, and those huge tanks have millions of gallons of water, and all kinds of foreign critters may be swimming around in there, or algae, or even bacteria that can be harmful. The zebra and quagga mussels came in that way. And so that's always been a big concern, and in more recent times we've heard so much about the Asian carp and the big threat that invasive fish poses to the Great Lakes if it ever gets in and gets established. And as we know, most of the attention to trying to keep the Asian carp out of the Great Lakes has been focused on the waterways around Chicago, where you have a network of rivers and canals that are connected to the Mississippi, and they come up and they go directly into Lake Michigan. And since Asian carp have already infested a lot of those waters, the fear is they'll be able to get up into Lake Michigan and eventually work their way around to most, if not all, of the Great Lakes. And there's a big debate underway as to how to stop that, to put up dams or some other physical structures to literally wall off the lakes from the Mississippi Basin, or some short of that, like maybe more electric barriers, that type thing. But while that debate has been going on, some of the scientists who have been following all this have been wondering about other pathways that the invasive fish, not just the Asian carp, but other invasive species might be able to utilize to get into the lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing a question that's been raised in the very beginning was, what about bait? What about fish bait? We know that there are a lot of people around the Great Lakes who love to fish. And in many cases, what people will do is go to a bait shop and they'll get a bucket of minnows in water, and they'll take them out and they'll do their fishing. And when they're finished, a lot of times they'll take that leftover bait and just dump it in the water. And has been for some time a campaign to convince people not to do that, because you never know for sure what's in that bait bucket. When they're little, minnows can look an awful lot alike, even if they are different species, and it can take a really trained eye to pick out a tiny silver carp or something like that from among other minnows. Yet there was a study within the past few years over in Canada that suggested that up to 30% of sport anglers were dumping their bait in the water. So these scientists from Notre Dame and from Central Michigan University, who have been working for some time on something called environmental DNA, decided to look into that. Now, eDNA, or environmental DNA, is basically just the genetic fingerprint, if you will, that fish leave behind in the water. When a fish swims along, it sheds excretions and even the mucus off its body, the scales that come off. All of those have DNA, just like with ourselves. When we leave fingerprints behind, you can get DNA from that, the genetic fingerprint that we all have. And it was the scientists using this method of getting water samples and checking them in a lab for fish DNA who first figured out that the Asian carp may have gotten a lot closer to Chicago than anyone realized, because they were finding DNA hits up near Chicago even when they weren't finding live fish. And there remains a debate about what exactly that means. But they used the same technique with the bait shops, and they went around and they visited more than 500 bait shops all over the Great Lakes region. And they took samples of water. They would go in and buy buckets of bait and then test the water and see what was in there. And they discovered in more than 24 cases that there was DNA of invasive fish in that water. There were a few for silver carp, which is one of the Asian carp varieties. There were DNA for a couple of types of goby, the round goby, the tube-nosed goby, of the Eurasian rough, I believe, and even goldfish, which are, of course, an aquarium pet type species, but they are in fact invasive. And so that's what they were turning up. And the conclusion that they drew is that even though that was only about 4% of all the samples they took, it's still enough for concern. And it just reinforces the message that needs to go out to people who go fishing, that when you use live bait and you finish your fishing for the day, you should not dump your bait back into the water. You can either put it in the trash or you can freeze it for future use or whatever. But don't dump your bait. It can be a very serious problem, and after all the millions or even potentially billions that are spent down at Chicago trying to wall off that area from Asian carp, it would be ironic indeed if Asian carp ended up getting into the Great Lakes just through people dumping their bait.
Yeah. Two questions I wanted to ask about that. Did the study identify where those handful of bait shops were that had the Asian carp DNA?
They did. In fact, there were 3 shops that had silver carp DNA, and they were all from the same area on Lake Erie in Ohio, around Sandusky Bay. And as it turns out, a couple of years ago, there was another report that found Asian carp DNA in the bay, in the water around the Maumee River, Sandusky River, Sandusky Bay, all in the western basin there of Lake Erie. And that's it's pretty sobering, because that area has always been considered one of the potential hotspots for Asian carp should they make it in. The Maumee River, of course, flows right down through Ohio and gets into Lake Erie. It's the biggest tributary for Erie, I believe. And so if they ever do get in that area, it could be a real problem.
The other question that it leads me to is, where does the bait come from? Where does the water with the bait come from? Is that something that's trucked in, or are these mom and pop shop owners just going out to the local bay
Yeah,
and scooping up?
It is really both. There are all kinds. They examined some of the more mom and pop varieties where people would go out and get their own, or people might bring it in and sell it. But there are also some wholesalers with their trucks who come in and will provide tens of thousands of minnows for these places. I believe I'm correct in this, that the 3 shops in Ohio that had the silver carp DNA had been served by the same wholesaler truck that had come in. And so there's a big chance that that one truck had come from outside the Great Lakes Basin with their minnows, and had maybe from some of these, maybe the Illinois River or some other areas where we know there are infested with Asian carp, and that's how they got their supply. So that's it's definitely a concern.
Wow. There's always something new to that story, isn't there?
There really is. There really is. It's a fascinating technology, eDNA, and it is controversial. There are some who say that it doesn't at all establish that this means there were live fish in this water. The DNA could have come from somewhere else. That's one of the ongoing scientific debates. But the Notre Dame scientists who pioneered this technology say that they believe that the most logical, the most likely explanation for finding the DNA of fish in water is that there was a live fish there that they released it. And it's probably within the previous 48 hours, because it tends to break down pretty quickly.
We've got just a couple minutes left. Again, John Flesher from the Associated Press with us. John, the other story that we wanted to talk about today was the possibility of a wolf hunt. Right. And I don't know, maybe the irrelevance of voters come this fall.
Yeah, it's been, of course, a huge, big debate for some time in Michigan these last few years about whether to allow wolf hunting or not. We've had one hunt last fall at which about 22 wolves were killed. And the opponents of these hunts have twice distributed petitions to get enough signatures to put on the ballot whether to keep or get rid of the laws that were passed by the legislature that allow the hunts to go forward. And they were all set to go, but people who support the hunts got their own petition drive, and they used a different tack, and that is to have what's called a citizen petition to put a certain law back before the legislature, and instead of putting it on the ballot. So they took it to the legislature, which just recently gave the okay. They passed it. And that means that this law will be on the books to give the Natural Resources Commission, which is a 7-member appointed commission appointed by the governor, to oversee natural resources policy. They will be the ones who will make the decision whether to declare a certain species game species that can be hunted, and if so, when to schedule a hunt and what the rules will be. And so that will be on the books. Now, because there's a 90-day delay in that law taking effect, and it's 90 days from the end of the session, which is still going on, it appears now that there will be no hunt this fall. The earliest that one could take place would be next year, and so there will be time for further debate. But in the meantime, we will have this fall on the ballot, there will be 2 questions with regard to wolf hunting, or the 2 laws that were passed earlier that could lead to wolf hunting. And people will be able to vote yea or nay. And if nothing else, the outcome of those votes would at least send a signal to the legislature about where the people of Michigan stand on that. Right. But those ballot initiatives will not have any legal force.
Well, that was kind of my question. Is it because that debate will continue, it may at least influence either your lawmakers or the Natural Resources Commission into which direction they want to go with that, exactly. Despite the lack of a legal standing?
Correct. Right.
Good. Well, John, I appreciate you coming in today and sitting with us here on the briefing room. Always appreciate hearing your insight, and always some great work with the AP.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. John Flesher with us here on the briefing room, and I'm Bill Froehlich from WTCM Radio. We'll see you next time right here on the briefing room.